Welcome to Game Design Hour, the podcast where each episode I sit down with the people who create the video games you know and love and talk with them about how their video games were made. On today's episode, I'm interviewing Anthony Giovannetti, one of the co-founders of Megacrit Games, about his work on the video game Slay the Spire. Slay the Spire is a roguelike card game. Throughout the levels, you build a deck made up of cards you have gathered to face combat encounters with strange and unique creatures. Now that you know a little about what Slay the Spire is, let's get into the interview. So what was the first thing that really kind of sparked your interest in creating video games?
I don't know. That's kind of hard. I've always played video games, even from a young age, and games were just like always the thing that kind of I was super interested in. I don't think that there was like a single moment or like a story per se, but it was just games were always what I was always about. And it was always the thing that drove me and like that made me want to do stuff. So when I was in school, I like got into computer science as because of games. Like coding was always kind of like a means to getting into games at the end of the day.
So how did you learn to code and create video games?
I took like AP computer science in high school. Then in college, I just did like a standard computer science degree. And then while I was in college, I also did some like early game development, like with Flash and things like that.
After college, how did you first get into the video game industry?
Sure. So I actually didn't go straight out of college into the game industry. Interestingly enough, I worked like a regular tech job and just kind of saved up money and just like got experience with software. And then it was after working for about like three-ish years, I met up with Casey again, my co-founder, and he and I went to college together, and we'd actually made like two little amateur games in college together. And we were like, hey, why don't we do this game dev thing again that we always wanted to do? And then we quit our jobs and did Slay the Spire.
How did you first think of the idea for Slay the Spire?
It's tough to say how I first thought about it, but I've been a card game player for a long time. I grew up playing Magic and other card games. I played a lot of Netrunner. I played many, many hours of Dominion and other deck builders. I actually managed a board game, card game shop for a while. And it's like I taught a lot of Dominion and games like it to people while I was working at the tech company that I was working at. And I just kind of like had a design document for this game that combined roguelike with deck building stuff. And then when I met up with Casey and we started to work on games again, I was like, oh, hey, I have this design document. Why don't we start with this? Like, how hard could this idea be? and then that kind of like ballooned into what became Slay the Spire.
How long were you working on that design document before you really started working on the game?
I honestly don't know. It was just something I like off and on. Like I would just like make little design documents for fun. Kind of, a lot of times like when I'm at work, I would just be bored and I'd be thinking about stuff. But, so sometime in that 3-year period of just like me idly dreaming up game ideas. When I left that, Slay the Spire took 2.5 years in development and then a year in early access.
After starting working on it, what were some of the first steps that you took towards creating the game?
So first steps are like creating an initial prototype, like an MVP. And then like I think we were testing that within like a week or two. We showed up at some like local Seattle indie game dev event and we just like showed it to a couple of people, see what they thought. And, this is like hyper basic. I mean, we had like 15 cards or something, maybe less. We had like little stick figures fighting each other. And so we were just like testing basic things. And even early on, we were getting positive feedback and then we just kept iterating from there.
What were some of the biggest inspirations for the game?
We had a lot of inspirations in Slay the Spire. Like I said, so like card games like Magic, Dominion, Ascension, other deck builders like Pulse Strike. I mean, there's a lot of deck builders I've played. In terms of roguelike, specifically FTL is a big inspiration. You see that in our map. Binding of Isaac was one that influenced like the relic system, how that works. Spelunky, actually. We've played a lot of roguelikes. Dead Cells was inspirational in kind of how we ran our early access.
Picking a game engine is a really important part of creating a video game because it's what you're making the game in. What game engine did you use to create Slay the Spire, and how was your experience with using it?
We used an engine called libgdx built on the lightweight Java game library. And what we liked about it is that it's like just code. There's no like UI or like dragging assets into other things. It's just all code. And that was really nice. The big problems with it were that it didn't handle porting very well. It wasn't good for that. It had a bunch of like issues with resolution stuff and other things. It worked okay. It was good for us because we were comfortable with it and we could go fast. I don't think it worked well for a project that like scaled to the size that Slay the Spire ended up being, which we didn't obviously expect when we were making the game. But it had its advantages and its disadvantages. It's a good like light game library.
Were there any interesting ideas that you had for the game that you brought up in a brainstorming process, or were maybe in the game in an earlier version that just ended up getting cut?
Oh yeah, I mean, I would be amazed if any game developer ever could say no to that question. I wouldn't like trust them, or I would think that they weren't making anything like serious. I mean, because honestly, like a big part of being a game developer is cutting. Like culling things and removing things is actually just kind of more important than adding and knowing what to cut. Like, I mean, we have thousands of ideas and documents that like didn't get added. I mean, the space of things that you add to your game is going to be like necessarily less than the space of things that you like come up with and aren't good or you cut. I think at least that's how it was for us. So
on the same topic of cutting stuff, managing scope is a really important part of creating video games. How did you work to manage the scope while working on Slay the Spire, and how did the scope change from your first idea to what you have now?
I mean, the first idea was quite different than how the game ended up, because you learn a lot of things during play testing. You try things that you think work and then they don't, and then you find things that you didn't expect would work or you didn't even like have in your brain at the start, and then you come up with them and they work out great, right? So like the intent system wasn't in my initial game design document. The game design document is more like a seed, and then everything sprouts from that. So, I mean, it changes in all kinds of ways. At some point you just have to be like, all right, we've done enough. We need to like launch something. And I don't know that like I didn't have like specific methodologies or anything for managing scope. You just kind of have to keep your eye on things and be like, okay, like what's reasonable? Hey, we want to actually launch this at some point. Like, you got to set dates and just kind of like rein yourself in. And, we were super small team. So it's not like I didn't have any methods. It was just like, okay, at this point, we think we're ready to launch into early access. Like we could always keep adding stuff, you could just develop for eternity, but that's silly. Like at some point, knowing when to stop is just its own skill. And we were like, okay, we'll launch this, we'll go into early access, and then we can still keep adding stuff in early access. And that's what we did. Mm-hmm. And then we were like, roughly for early access, we were thinking, okay, here's a few milestones we want. Like, we want an actual like secret final boss thing. We want this many characters, et cetera. There were a few milestones like that we knew we had to hit to get into 1.0. And then besides that, we were like, we want to spend about a year in early access. So it was kind of like, here's our milestones that we know we need to hit. And then here's like our ideal time that we spend in early access. And then we use those to inform like that process.
How close did you get to hitting those goals within the time frame that you set?
We did fine. I mean, I think we were in there for like literally a year. So, close to it. And then we hit all of our milestone goals. And then after early access, we released the Watcher, which was like a bonus character.
Did you always plan for the game to be a roguelike, or was there ever a point where you considered not having it be a roguelike?
Yeah, I mean, the core of the design was like roguelike plus card game. And the idea for how that works is that the part of card games that I like is like drafting, deck building. Playing the same deck over and over again isn't very fun, at least for me. I know it is for some people, but I think like the thing that makes like a game like Magic interesting isn't if I'm just grinding out playing the same deck over and over again. It's the actual act of like, okay, finding the synergies, finding the cards that work well together, trying things out. That's the fun part. And so like the core insight of why Slay the Spire works is that the roguelike skeleton, the framework that it brings into a game, actually synergizes really well with that goal. So because you're playing a roguelike and because you're playing like fast runs and you don't carry your deck over from run to run, it gives you an excuse to always be building different decks and trying out new cards together. Right. And so you can imagine a different kind of game that we called Slay the Spire, where like, at the start of the run or something, you like chose cards to put into your deck. And that game is like totally different than the roguelike version of Slay the Spire. And that's like a completely different concept, even though they would both be card games.
How long have you been playing Magic the Gathering?
I mean, since I was a little kid, so, kind of as I have very early memories of like going into a physical mall back when Wizards of the Coast had store locations, and my grandfather like buying me a deck of Magic cards, or like a pre-constructed deck, because I thought the art looked cool or something. And, I had no idea what the cards did or anything, just like looking through them and being like, oh, look at this, and like, oh, this cool little dragon or whatever. And then I've played all kinds of card games. So I find card games for me were always some of my favorite kinds of games, the games where you could just like get really deep into them and experience them as like a lifestyle game.
With so many different cards in the game, are you able to tell me a bit about your process for thinking of creating and designing the different cards?
So basically how it works is we just brainstorm up a bunch of card ideas, and then we'll like show them to each other, and we'll be like, okay, I like this one, I like this one, I like this one, or oh, I like this idea, but it needs these tweaks, or oh, this idea is crap, throw it away. And so we'll brainstorm a bunch of cards, and then we would like think about them, maybe tweak the numbers, and then we would just like implement them, just throw them in, and then see if the ideas were good or not. It was really that simple. It's just like brainstorming and then iterating. And then, I have such an experience of playing card games that is, I think like generating cards is pretty easy. Like, in a single day, you can come up with all kinds of crazy card ideas. It's just actually finding the good ones and like filtering down to that. That's where it gets tricky. Or like, actually balancing the cards. That's where the real effort comes in. But just like generating card ideas, like that's fun. That's super easy. One thing you'll see on like Hearthstone or Magic or any other big card game is you'll probably find like a subreddit or like a section of a forum or something where people just come up with cards, like custom cards, like, and you can find people coming up with all kinds of crazy card ideas. And it's just a fun thing to do, that if you play card games, you're often thinking about that kind of stuff. Do you play any card games yourself?
Yeah, I play Magic the Gathering.
Okay, yeah. Like you've probably thought of like, your own Magic cards, or you probably looked at a card and be like, oh, why'd they do it this way? They should have tweaked this card in this way. Yeah. Like, everyone has strong opinions on cards. I have yet to find like a Magic player who doesn't have strong opinions on certain cards in the game, right? So it's just that same kind of, you build up these intuitions over like the decades that I've played card games. And I kind of just use those as like my guiding light in designing cards. And then hopefully your intuitions are good. And at least I think mine are. Yeah.
In that brainstorming process of just coming up with a bunch of cards, were there any interesting card ideas that you came up with, but just would absolutely break the game?
Oh, yeah. I mean, sure. I can't think of any specific ones, but yeah, I think the one I always remember, because we implemented it fairly early on, was it was like an ironclad card, and it was like a Thorns effect, but that it like ramped up every turn as well. And I don't know, there was something about it that was just like super broken, and I can never remember the details, because I've seen at this point so many hundreds, if not thousands, of versions of things that any like specific one doesn't really hold its place in my mind. Yeah, I mean, we've made a lot of really broken stuff over the time, and even a lot of the things that exist in the game, we've like had to tweak them down, right? So a lot of our balance patches wasn't just like adding buffs to stuff, but also like nerfing other strategies and things.
As you've said, deck building and making combos with cards is a really important part of card games. When you were creating the cards, how much were you thinking about how these cards can interact with other cards, and how much were you surprised by what players did?
Cards synergizing with each other is always a really important thing, and it's part of when you're designing a character, especially that we're like always thinking of, because you want to have like strategies, right? Like, so like you don't just make So for the silent, for example, you're not just like, okay, here's a single poison card. Like we're going to make a whole mechanic for one card. It's like, okay, I'm going to make this mechanic and then I'm going to like support it. I'm going to like make a bunch of cards for it and try to add things that synergize with it or different strategies. And one of the things that we tried to do is we tried to create cards that we actually considered them like build around me cards. So cards that you could see, and then the player can go, oh, I think I know how I can break this card, or oh, I know what'll work really well with this. And that gives them like reason to think, okay, I can take this and then try to shift some of my strategy around it. And cards like that are really good for fostering that kind of activity. So we definitely like intentionally put that into the game. And then, you can never anticipate everything your players are going to do. I mean, it's crazy all of the stuff like our players in our community have done. In particular, like the speedrunners. Like you look at some of the speedrunner stuff and it just stuns me because I cannot like beat Slay the Spire in 5 minutes. But definitely those kind of synergies and interactions are like way at the forefront. And it was something we were very aware of and that we wanted to support. And it's just, you have to like hit the right balance. You don't want to make it so that things are too forced from like the designer's perspective. You want it to be open to the players, so they're coming up with their own strategies and synergies, but you also want to be putting in like nuggets of inspiration and also some things that are like, okay, I can you put this card in, and the reason I designed this card is to like clearly point you in the direction of different synergies, right? So like an example is like the card Heavy Blade, which gets extra bonuses from strength, right? The point of a card like that is I put that in to say, hey, maybe you should try to like, stack a bunch of strength and see how that works, right? And you can do things like that to kind of give directions to players.
Fixing bugs is a huge part of developing video games. Were there any strange or interesting bugs that you came across while working on Slay the Spire?
The bugs were far too numerous for me to remember like a single standout. I mean, some of the fun ones are when you do like a little visual bug and like, like maybe Casey will find a bug and show it to me and we have a little laugh because like some little minor thing just causes, a huge ballooning tweak that like just stands out and is super obvious. And those are fun, but nothing super memorable. The most annoying bugs are the ones that aren't like that, where it's just like some annoying thing in the code that's like hard to reproduce, and it has some like minor impact that's hard to see when it even happens, and those are very not fun. But yeah, I mean, a lot of what you do is fixing bugs in game development, and it seems like that task can never end. Like there's always bugs to be fixed. But I don't think I look back at any specific bug or anything and I'm like, yeah, that was a fun bug. So I don't know. I don't think I have a good story for that one.
Creating encounters can be difficult to balance it for all the different player types, especially in games like this where you don't know what cards and potions players might have when entering the encounter. How did you work to create the encounters in a way that players can beat them with different types of deck builds, but no one deck build is completely overpowered against all of the encounters?
There's a couple answers to that. So one, when we initially design encounters, we have like, kind of our initial holistic idea that we try to make a balance, but surely we're going to go back and tweak it. And you go back and tweak it because, you yourself, or so like ourselves as designers, we go in and we play test it a lot and then see if it feels right, if everything feels good to us. Then the other thing is that we have our play testers play it a bunch, and then we get data from what they're doing, and we could see, oh, hey, the Red Masked Bandit encounter is doing like this much damage on average to players, and it's killing this many players, stuff like that. And we can kind of see, okay, all the encounters in this act are generally doing like this range of damage, but this encounter is doing like way more or way less. We got to tweak it up or down. So we use a lot of metrics and just play testing hours, right, to figure those things out and tweak it. And then in terms of like trying to make it so there's not just like one single best deck, a lot of our design is we would make it so that certain elites or bosses would ask specific questions of the player. And so what I mean by that is like the gremlin knob, right? It kind of gives you a check. It's like, okay, can you deal enough damage to actually like get through me? You can't just have a bunch of defense. Like that's not going to work against me very well, right? And so it kind of presents a challenge to you that you need to factor into your deck building. And like a boss like the Time Eater, right? It says, hey, if all you can do is infinitely do a tiny amount of damage, you're probably going to get crushed by me. So you need some way to deal with that. Or like a boss like the Champ really wants you to have a lot of scaling, right? So you put up these different challenges to the player, and you have to try to like solve that challenge in your drafting and your deck building. And because we vary the types of questions that these different enemies and encounters ask, you can kind of like get a good balanced distribution across decks that no one's strategy, I should say, can just like crush everything like effortlessly, right? So that's kind of the goal, is to kind of make it wide by that. And I think that like question and answer based strategy works pretty well.
How large was the team that created Slay the Spire?
It was pretty tiny. So it was me, Casey, my co-founder, and then Danielle, my wife. And then we had a few contractors. We had Clark, who was our composer. And then we had 3 artist contractors total. So we had one artist who handled like all of the card and event art. We had one artist who did like all of the background art, and then we had an animator. Yeah, it was a pretty small team.
How did you do your play testing for this game? And what about this playtesting process will you take with you when you're working on your future projects?
We're definitely taking like the entirety of our playtesting process to future projects. So we were really big on playtesting early and often. And we started out getting like people we know, friends, into like either a Slack or a Discord, and then having them playtest, right? And so what we do is we'd give them access to builds. They comment at any time on stuff. The metrics from their plays would also get uploaded to a server, so we could see the data on that. And then also we do a lot of like just watching people play. So either in-person watching or like screen share, and we just kind of silently watch them play the game, and then maybe we record it. And then we did a lot of going to events as well, like local Seattle indie events. And then we had like a demo of the game, and then we would show it, and just we would like sit with notebooks behind people who were playing it. And we would just like write down every little thing we saw as they were playing it. So we'd be like, oh, looks like this player didn't notice that they still had energy left. What can we do visually to help indicate that they still had energy that they could have used to play cards? Things like that. Or like, oh, this player didn't quite notice that they needed to hit end turn, or like little things like that. So we really focused on like UI, UX stuff like that as well for things like that. But we did a lot of playtesting all throughout our development, and I think it's huge. One thing we did is that an advantage we had is I was a very big Netrunner player, and I actually created like the biggest Netrunner fan site, and we had a big forum. So I was a big Netrunner tournament player, so I was friends with all of like kind of the best Netrunner players out there. Especially good friends with like the guy who won Netrunner Worlds multiple times in a row. So I knew a bunch of really strong competitive Netrunner is a card game, sorry, players. And so I would bring a lot of these people who I knew into playtest as well, and they gave me a lot of good feedback. The more you playtest, the better from my perspective. I think we will always do that as a studio going forward. Which
parts of the game did you have to put the most time and effort into to get just the way you wanted it?
Oh, I mean, I don't know, everything. The balance takes forever. Solving lots of UX stuff takes a long time. I don't know. I don't know if there was like a particular thing. It's just game development takes a lot of work and a lot of time. And it's just the whole process takes a while. Like you'll be in that, you'll solve like 90% of everything, and you'll be in that last 10% for forever. It feels like, as you're just like polishing and fixing things up and sorting bugs out. There's always tasks to be done. There's not just like a single thing that it's like, oh yeah, this is like, the last thing to do. And then it's just, there's always stuff to do.
Are there any fun little details that you added into the game that you really like, but you think most players might miss?
Yeah, we added a few little like Easter egg things. So like in Act 1, you can click the torches to actually like turn them off and turn them back on. Some of the musical relics, you can actually like, when you click them, they'll make a little noise. things like that. So we added a few fun little effects that I wish we had more time to do more of that. But yeah, we tried to add in little cute little interactable things like that where we could.
What was the biggest challenge that you faced while working on Slay the Spire?
I mean, the big thing is just solving work-life balance is not something I did very well. Definitely my life was basically work. There's a lot of just 80-hour work weeks, and you're just doing that constantly. And I kind of wish, I don't know, I'm of two minds of it, because I kind of wish that I had, maybe done a better job of managing that. But at the same time, I like the results, and and I wouldn't have wanted to work on Slay the Spire for even longer. So it's tough. But in terms of, we actually didn't have like a crazy, like, oh no, there was this big thing that got in the way of our development. Our development was pretty like week to week, like consistent, actually. Like we did a good job of prioritizing things, and every week we would just make steady, consistent progress. I think there were a few times that we maybe wasted too much time, like doing stuff to try to go to an event or something. And that was like time that we could have been spent working on the game more, but maybe not too. It's tough to say. So I don't think there was like a single standout thing. Sometimes development's just consistent.
Looking back now, is there anything you wish you could have done differently before the initial launch of the game?
No, because it all worked out great. Our marketing plan was pretty weak. Our initial like 2 weeks were pretty bad, actually. It was most games, the first 2 weeks is huge for them, but for us, our first 2 weeks sucked, and it was more built over time that things started to really ramp up for us. But I think that's okay, actually. Like the thing is that at the end of the day, it worked out really good for us, but better than I could have ever hoped, right? So when we were working on Slay the Spire, I never expected the level of success that we were going to have. I think if I had expected that, that would have been very weird, right? Like, so most indies, especially this is our first professional game, right? Like, you're not going to do that well. So like the reference class was that, hey, I hope that we can sell enough copies of this game so that quitting our software jobs wasn't like this huge financial decision. and we had created some like conservative projections on how much we thought we would sell. And then Slay the Spire ended up exceeding our wildest expectations by a lot. So would I have changed anything? Well, I don't know. I mean, things turned out pretty good. So I think there are some minor things that, we could have done differently, or like maybe some business level decision stuff. But, I'm happy with how the game design in particular turned out. I think the process went well.
What is the biggest lesson that you learned from working on this game?
I'll be honest. I think that there are some things some like business kind of things, but in terms of like what I learned, I mean, I could say I learned like, just how valuable playtesting is. I have some things that confirmed some things like that, but there wasn't really like a eureka moment, right? Yeah, I don't know. I don't know that I have a good answer to that question in particular.
What would be your biggest piece of advice to a newer game dev trying to go and get their first game made?
Whenever people ask me that, because it's something that I get asked a lot in different forms, I always send them a link to an article written by Derek Yu, the creator of Spelunky, which is about finishing games. And I think it's like the best thing that you can read, because I think that actually just finishing things is very, very underappreciated as a difficult skill. And it's something that I'm glad I got experience with by doing amateur game dev in college, because I did finish 2 games and release them in college. And I think that was a very worthwhile experience to have. And I think that the best advice I can give is actually just go make some like simple games and actually release them to start. And because that's the big thing. So Spire was our first professional game, but we had already made games in college, released them. And, we had worked in the software industry for a few years, like doing actual like software, right? It wasn't like our first. I see a lot of people that like their very first project ever, it's just too much, and they tackle some big crazy project. But really just actually getting experience with starting something, like actually starting it, not just thinking about it, but actually starting an idea meaningfully working on it and then actually like meaningfully finishing it and releasing it and being like, okay, I'm done. That like being able to handle that flow is itself a very, very important skill. And it's a very underestimated skill. So just actually going through that process is one of the best things you can do. So do game jams, go like work on small little projects, get some experience, then. And the good thing about that is it doesn't take a lot of time too. So failing fast is a good thing. Starting on an idea, learning if that idea is crap or not, and then maybe quickly finishing it is a very good thing. And then if you stumble onto something that turns out like, oh, this is looking amazing, then you can go spend a bunch of time on it.
What's next for you? What are you working on now?
Well, that's a secret. We're working on our next game, but I will not say anything else about it. At some point, we will make an official announcement and stuff, but we're not actually do marketing correctly this time, right? So, yeah.
Thank you so much for your time. It's been great interviewing you.
Yeah, thanks. Appreciate it.
I want to thank you so much for listening to today's episode. If you enjoyed it, make sure to give us a follow on whatever platform you're listening to this on. If you think that a friend might like the show, make sure to share it with them as well. Also, if you're really enjoying the show, make sure to give us a rating on whatever platform you're listening to this on. If you want to stay up to date with what's going on with Game Design Hour, make sure to follow us at Game Design Hour on TikTok, Instagram, or Twitter. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode, and I hope I can see you around on our next episode, which will come out on September 5th. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next time.